Nous sommes très honorés d'avoir avec nous, comme Brigitte vient de le dire, Peter Singer. Est-ce que c'est la peine que je le présente? J'ai l'impression que tout le monde dans la salle le connaît. For the one or two people who don't know who he is, donc philosophe et professeur de bioéthique, il enseigne en Australie et aux États-Unis. En même temps, il est titulaire de la chaire d'éthique de l'université de Princeton. En 1975, bien sûr, c'est lui qui publie La Libération animale, l'ouvrage fondateur du mouvement contemporain des droits des animaux. D'autres livres, Questions d'éthique pratique, Une gauche darwinienne, Sauver une vie, Agir maintenant pour éradiquer la pauvreté. Les animaux ont aussi des droits et l'éthique à table. Peter Singer, vous aurez l'occasion de lui poser quelques questions, soit tout de suite après son discours, soit en fin d'après-midi. And he will be speaking, I think, in English. Peter, where are you? Here he is. Big round of applause. Peter, onto the stage, please. Peter, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
How would...
Very happy to be here and have such a great crowd. It's terrific.
I don't think you're going to have much time to speak with all the applause. How would you like to do it? Would you like the questions right at the end of the afternoon or some questions after your first speech? Now, we'll see how it goes? Or?
Yeah, we can see how it goes,
Okay.
but if I would like to leave some time for questions.
I'll be right here to go and hand the microphone. Je vous donne le micro pour y
let me
poser
watch
des
the
questions.
time. I'll take this off so I can watch the time
voilà.
and see how we're going.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. Okay. So firstly, I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this wonderful event, L214. I think it's great to be able to have the opportunity to speak to you here in Paris. I think it's an important moment for the development of animal liberation, and I will say a little bit about why that is so in a few moments. I thought what I have said I would talk about is the paths to animal liberation, and by that I mean the paths to implementing the ideas that I expressed in my book Animal Liberation that was published 40 years ago this year, and the way in which we can end the exploitation of animals, which is continuing and, in fact, in some respects is growing, but in other respects which we have made progress towards changing. But let me begin by talking about the essential ethical principles on which I think this movement is founded and which I tried to set out in that book such a long time ago. Because I think that what has to underpin the progress towards animal liberation is the idea that this is an important ethical issue, that this is one of the challenges that we face if we want to think of ourselves as a society that is living ethically, and also if we want to think of ourselves more personally as individuals who are living ethically. When I first came across the thoughts that led to my writing the book, it was while I was a graduate student at Oxford University in 1970, and the very idea that something about animals could be a really important moral issue had not occurred to me up to that point. Now today that may seem rather strange. How could somebody get to the age of 24, especially if they're working in philosophy and indeed in ethics, and not really think about the way in which we treat animals? But that was perfectly normal then, because there was no animal movement that really challenged the way we think about animals. All there was the more traditional animal organizations like the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which was mostly concerned about dogs and cats and horses, and I was certainly not cruel to dogs or cats, so what they were saying did not challenge me in any way. But I was eating meat and really oblivious to what was involved in that, and I was certainly oblivious to the idea that the whole attitude that we have to animals was something that was fundamentally morally wrong. So I was challenged to think about this simply by happening to have lunch with somebody who in those days was very unusual. He was a vegetarian, and he was not a vegetarian for any peculiar religious reasons. He was not a vegetarian because he thought meat would be bad for his health. He was a vegetarian because he didn't like what was implied in rearing and killing animals and putting them on his plate. And I was eating animals, and I hadn't really thought even about that question. But perhaps because I was a student of philosophy, I thought this is a question that I ought to think about. And therefore I started not only to talking to him and to a couple of his friends who had similar views, but reading about this, reading about what philosophers had said about this in the past, and what they had said about it at that time, or perhaps rather I should say what they were not saying about it at that time. Because if you think back to 1970, most of you probably can't think back, but if you remember what you've read about that period, there was a lot of discussion about important ethical questions. The Vietnam War was going on, so there were questions about whether that war was morally just, whether you should resist the war, whether you should not accept to be drafted if you were living in a country that was fighting in Vietnam. There were questions about racism, and the black liberation movement was developing, so there were questions about human rights. The beginning of the women's liberation movement or the feminist movement, and there were questions about women's rights. So there was a lot of debate about rights, but it was all focused on humans. And even those philosophers who were writing about this, they would produce arguments about why all humans have rights, but they would never say, why don't the animals also have rights? They would never even look beyond this boundary of our own species. It was the same assumption that I had been making up to that point, that all important moral issues are about the treatment of human beings. But it's obvious, if you think about it, that there are beings beyond our own species that are capable of suffering and that do suffer. In fact, that we inflict suffering on in very extreme ways, and in ways that are not at all necessary for our own survival or well-being. So you only have to start looking at this to see that there is at least a moral question here. And you only have to start looking at what the philosophers had written to see that actually there is a blind spot, that they are not thinking about these issues either. And even though their arguments would often actually carry over to non-human animals, they never even mention them. So that's what led me to start thinking that this is an important issue that we have to think about more. And eventually, 3 or 4 years later, I wrote Animal Liberation and developed my thoughts on that. But this message has now, I think, to some extent got out beyond philosophy departments and has got out into the mainstream. But so there is a movement, an animal movement, when we see it here, and the number of people who've come today, and the fact that this event sold out, that there is a lot of interest in this now here in France, as there has been in many other countries. But it is still not really accepted, I think, in the mainstream. So that mainstream still has the idea that, yes, we should have some concern for animals, perhaps. We shouldn't be unnecessarily cruel to them. But it still has the idea that it's all right for us to use them for our own purposes, with some boundaries, some limits to what that cruelty could be. But what that means is that we still do not have animals really as part of our central moral concern. We still think that if we want to eat them, it's okay to not only to kill them for us to eat them, but to raise them in ways that obviously are not suited to their real needs, to put them inside, to confine them in various ways, to prevent them doing the things that they naturally do, like prevent the hens from scratching in the dirt, to separate the cows and their calves in order to have milk for us to consume. We still have this idea that their interests don't really matter. And that's what, to me, seems fundamentally wrong. We have to get away from that. We have to get to the principle where we should be giving equal weight, equal consideration to their interests as to the interests or the similar interests of human beings. So if an animal suffers, if a cow or a pig or a dog or a cat suffers, that suffering doesn't matter less because it's not a member of our species. That suffering is still just as bad a thing if it is a similar amount of suffering. Which is not to say that there might not be some kinds of suffering that we experience that you can only experience if you have cognitive capacities that non-human animals don't have. But there are clearly important ways in which animals can suffer, not just physical pain, but as I said, the emotional suffering of separation of a mammal from her child, the emotional suffering of stressful confinement and crowding, and the suffering of boredom and so on. All of those things which animals clearly can feel and experience and do experience, which we are not giving the proper weight to that we should be giving. So the way of summing up this idea, I think, is to think of the way we regard animals as akin to the way in which more than 200 years ago Europeans regarded Africans as objects that you could buy or sell, that you could trade in for your convenience, for the convenience of people in the New World who wanted to produce cotton or tobacco and wanted slave labor in order to do it. And just as they had an ideology that enabled them to justify that to themselves, and of course that ideology was a form of racism, so we have an ideology that enables us to justify to ourselves the way in which we use animals. And that ideology I refer to as speciesism, to make that parallel, that there's a dominant group which exploits others and has a way of thinking that justifies that to itself. So I think one of the foundations that underlies the path to animal liberation is to try to have more people see this, to make this kind of mental switch from thinking, oh yes, of course, naturally we are the dominant species on the planet and that's fine, to thinking, no, we are actually in a position of power and we have rationalized what we do, we have justified it to ourselves in a way that is not really ethically defensible, and therefore the struggle for equal consideration for animals ranks alongside these other great struggles that we have been fighting against racism, against sexism, against homophobia, all of these sorts of things that we regard as important moral issues. This is another important moral issue alongside them. And in fact, in terms of the numbers of animals affected by it worldwide, it clearly affects more sentient beings than any other. Because each year we raise and kill about 65 billion animals, so almost 10 times the population of the entire planet. All right, if that's the foundation of moving forward, let me say a little bit about how we can best do this. And it is something that we can do both on an individual level and on a political level. On an individual level, we can make the choice ourselves to stop contributing to this abuse of animals. And as long as you are still buying the products of industrial agriculture, you are giving them the only kind of approval that they really need. You are giving them your money as an incentive to continue to produce those products. So I think that's important to stop that, and it's important to be an advocate for stopping that, so that this idea spreads, and the idea of living in a way that is cruelty-free, following as closely as practical a vegan lifestyle, that is an important step. And I say as closely as practical because I don't hold the kind of ethic that thinks that any tiny violation of a rule means that you've completely failed and you may as well just give up altogether and go back to eating meat. I think you have to be concerned about the consequences of what you're doing. So it's not a matter of moral purity in that sense. It's not like keeping a kosher diet or something like that. It's a matter of saying, when I can reasonably make this choice, I'm going to choose not to support these animal industries, and I'm going to spread that message as much as I can. And I think this is important because, as I was saying before, this seems to be a moment when this is becoming more popular, when, particularly in Europe, I've noticed in traveling in Europe, there are more vegan options available. There is more recognition of vegan diets and of the fact that there are people who want to eat vegan. And we need to try to make this mainstream. We need to have good vegan options in every restaurant, in every supermarket, because once we make it easier for people, the movement can grow more rapidly. So I've been coming to France every few years, I guess, since I was living in Oxford in the early 1970s. And at first there was simply no comprehension even of the idea of being a vegetarian, I have to say. It seemed in France, coming from England, it was a much stranger idea to be a vegetarian and to want vegetarian food in France than it was in England. But now, on this visit, I can see that things are changing, as they're changing in other countries where it was also very difficult. I've come from Germany, I was in Austria not so long ago. These countries that also had very much meat and animal-centered diets are now providing more vegan options. So I think this is a really important moment to push that. And that's one path to animal liberation, a personal path. But I think we also have to take a political path. We have to try to make this an important political issue so that political parties have to take a stand on it. Again, as they take a stand on the other big issues. You can't really be a political party today, for instance, without having some stand on what you think about refugees and people, immigrants, asylum seekers trying to come across the Mediterranean if you're in Europe, or in Australia if they're trying to come through Indonesia and land in Australia. Political parties feel compelled to take these stands, but they still don't really feel compelled always to take a stand on the treatment of animals, on animal agriculture. And we have to make enough noise to make them realize that this is a major political issue, that the voters want to know before deciding how to vote. They want to know where they stand on these questions. And there are different ways of doing this. In some countries, the way to do this may be to form a party specifically for the animals, as exists in the Netherlands, for instance, and where they've been successful in getting 3 members, I think it currently is, into the national parliament. In other countries, depending on the electoral system, that may not be very realistic. it may be better to work through an already existing party, which might be the Greens. The Greens tend to be sympathetic to animal issues. If it might be, for various reasons, one of the other major parties. But I think that political route is important, and we have to try to campaign for reforms in various ways. Now, some people will say, I've talked about the importance of personally avoiding animal products, and I've talked about political reform. Is there some kind of opposition between these two strategies? Some people will say, for example, that if you have reform of the conditions of animals existing in farms, you weaken the case for going vegan, because people will think, oh, the conditions are not so bad. We got a law through, and now the hens, which used to live in a cage this size, for 4 hens, let's say, they live in a cage this size. So it's a bit better, isn't it? Well, it is a bit better, and I think that, in fact, it is worth trying to do that, because I don't think there's much real evidence that the reforms that we're getting are reducing the number of people who are avoiding animal products. On the contrary, it seems that the countries that have most progressive laws are also the countries with the largest numbers of vegetarians and vegans. But there's another factor here that's worth mentioning as well. We want people to make choices away from animal products and towards other products. And obviously they need to eat, and they want to eat things that they enjoy eating. So at the moment there is a competition. There are starting to be more and more plant-based products that can replace meat or be alternatives to meat or taste like meat in various ways. And there are traditional products, of course, like tofu that have always been around that are alternatives to meat. But there is an economic component. And if the meat product is particularly cheap, as, say, chicken often is, that's going to be a factor with many people. Well, if we can raise the standards of animal welfare, even in ways that are not at all adequate for the standards of any decent animal ethic, we are increasing the costs of producing those products. I mean, if it wasn't going to increase the costs, that would be already the way in which those animals were looked after. It's economics that has driven producers in a competitive market to crowd more hens into a cage, or more hens onto the floor of a shed, or to confine pigs indoors where they need less looking after, to not give them any straw because it takes a bit of labour to replace the straw and some cost. Anything that adds to the cost of production of animal products will make the alternatives more competitive. Just as we ought to be adding to the costs of, let's say, producing electricity by burning coal in order to make solar and wind and other renewables more competitive, so we ought to be doing what we can to add to the costs of the meat production, which incidentally is also a major contributor to climate change, and that's another cost that we have from it. So I think that I thought you were coming to tell me my time is up. Ah, right. Thank you very much. That is good. My throat is getting dry. We need to try to do both of these things. I don't think it's an either-or choice at all. I think that ultimately our goal should be, for the ethical reasons that I've given you, our goal should be the abolition of commercial animal raising. It's very hard for me to see how, if animals are things that are raised commercially, we are ever going to get to the point where we are really treating them ethically, really respecting their lives as they should be respected, and thinking of them in the way that we should be thinking of them. But I don't believe that we're going to get to this point anytime really soon. I don't have the capacity, unfortunately, to look into the future, so it's very hard to say. But I would say you would have to think it's going to be at least 20 years before we have a society in which is not actually still consuming large quantities of animal products. In fact, you know, more likely I would say it's going to be longer than that, but perhaps we ought to set a 50-year goal for when we could really be living in a society that is an ethical society as far as its relations with animals are concerned. And in the meantime, I do think the suffering of the billions and tens of billions of animals each year matters. And that is something that is important. And I think that we should do something to reduce that suffering here and now as far as we possibly can. So I see this as an important route, and I think the changes that have happened in Europe are things that are in small ways beneficial to animals, and they are things that we ought to encourage, and we ought to be doing both things at once, trying to reduce the size of the animal industries and trying to reduce the immediate and present and acute suffering of those animals. Okay, so I've talked about an individual path to animal liberation. I've talked about a political path to animal liberation. Let me say there's one more thing, and I've already talked about the ways in which animal products, alternatives to animal products can help to move people away from a diet that is supporting cruelty to animals. I think encouraging the development of those products is an important thing to do. So in the United States, there are a couple of young animal rights advocates with some business experience and background who decided to try to see what they could do to reduce the number of animal products consumed, not just on an individual level, but on a large scale. So they picked out the industrial use of eggs. Okay, so in the United States, I don't know what the figures are here in France, in the United States, about 30% of all eggs are not sold as whole eggs to consumers. They are sold as products. So the eggs go into cakes and other products that use eggs. And they thought it should not be too difficult to develop a product which is plant-based, which has the similar cooking qualities to eggs, that is cruelty-free, that is sustainable, and that will in addition avoid some of the health risks of eggs, because there are various downsides to eggs, both in terms of cholesterol, but also in terms of the spreading of salmonella, where there have been many cases of people becoming ill through eating eggs and egg products. So they set up a firm called Hampton Creek Foods, which is, I would say, on the edge of becoming a major commercial success. It's already producing egg-free mayonnaise, which is being sold in American supermarkets, and it is working on developing other egg products and replacing that. So I think anything that enables us to find good alternatives, to find new techniques which will be, as I say, cruelty-free, environmentally sustainable, healthy, and economically competitive, is going to be an important step in the path to ending the exploitation of animals. So I will stop talking at that point. I think that will still give us a few minutes for some questions and discussion, and I look forward to hearing that from you. Thank you.
Hi, Peter Singer. I'm really pleased to meet you and to have the honor of seeing you. My name is Laetitia. I'm a French young graduate from a business school, and I really want to get involved in animal liberation, want to make a change. And I often wonder, actually, what can we answer as European citizens or citizens of the Western world to Chinese or Asian people who eat more and more meat every day, and how can we really have the impact on a world base when we see that actually those people are really changing the way animals are treated, and it's actually getting more and more like worse because they are eating a bigger volume of animals. So do you think, for example, Hampton Creek has a chance in Asian world, and do you think we can have an impact on a world basis compared to Chinese people who eat more and more chickens, for example?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question, because certainly meat consumption is rising sharply in China and in other parts of Asia. But I think the best way in which we can help them to change is by example. Because even though meat consumption is rising there, on a per capita basis, we are still eating more meat here in Europe, and certainly more meat in North America, than the Chinese are, and much more than the Indians are. So I think, in the United States, meat consumption has just started to fall in the last 5 years. After rising steadily, more or less forever, it started to come off the peak now, and I hope that will continue. But I think we need to show people in Asia that it was a mistake that we went down when we started eating so much meat, and we're moving away from it. And I certainly think that people in China would be very ready for that. I mean, certainly you see everywhere in East Asia, you see alternatives to dairy products being sold. Soy milk is something that has been very widely used for a long time in Asia. And I think they would be very ready to accept other alternatives. And there is a whole school of Chinese cooking which produces plant-based alternatives made out of seitan or gluten or tofu. So I think that we can turn this around. I agree that it's very urgent because there are, of course, 1.4 billion Chinese and more than 1 billion Indians. So it's urgent, but I think we can do it.